very happy to be here, both to see Bill, who I've known for many, many years, and to help to support his effort to make evidence-based treatments more widely available. I'm going to be talking about a bit different area, an area really of an intersection of psychology and the law, an area that touches many people's lives. So it's perhaps a bit different than some of the other interventions that you've been hearing about here. This is a topic that's controversial for many people. There's father's rights arguments, there's mother's rights arguments, and we'll be touching on some of that. Let me, though, as kind of a disclaimer to begin with, both because there's a lot of material that I want to get through the course of the day. I may limit questions. I welcome your questions, but I may have to cut you off because at times because we need to get through lots of material during the course of the day. And what I try to do as much as possible is to really stick to that evidence base. You know, where we have research to support what we're doing with children, what we're doing with families, what we're doing both for mothers and for fathers. I like to think of myself in all of this when you get into the rights framework as really as an advocate for children, right? Not an advocate for mothers or fathers, but really an advocate for kids. And that generally makes me an advocate for both of their parents, but I come to focus on children. I've titled the workshop, I changed it slightly from what Bill just mentioned. I use different titles. I've titled it Negotiating Agreements and Renegotiating Relationships. Mediation is all about negotiating what's often called a parenting plan, what sometimes is called custody. If you're in Texas, it's called a conservatorship. You know, terms vary from state to state. I often just talk about this in terms of what you're trying to do as far as kids go is divide time and divide decision-making powers. And we'll talk about these issues as we go in. But even as and this is the more psychological part of it, even as you're negotiating the basis of a legal agreement, a memorandum of understanding, we generally term it, you are helping families to renegotiate their relationships. Because as we'll see, when a couple splits up, and I'll use the term divorce a lot, but of course these days many couples that are having kids together and are breaking up or have never been married, I use the term divorce to refer to cohabiting couples with a relationship as well. Their intimate relationship ends, but their parenting partnership doesn't, right? You are a parent for life. And so people who are intimate partners need to not end their relationship, they need to renegotiate and redefine it. And in many ways, that's what mediation is all about. What I would want to do in this next segment of the all-day program is to talk about research on children and divorce. Here's yet another book that I've written on divorce that really is more a research-oriented book. This is a book that's written, if Truth About Children and Divorce is for parents, Renegotiating Family Relationships is for practitioners, this book is for researchers. It's a careful overview of the research on children and divorce. So if you want to find more detail, you'll see it there. The take-home message of this part of the talk is really going to be stress, risk, resilience, and pain. Quickly, that is that for almost every kid, the process of divorce is going to be stressful. That our best research evidence shows that divorce creates a risk for increased psychological problems, everything from ADHD to behavior problems to depression for kids. The third, though, is that even though divorce puts kids at risk for developing psychological problems, resilience is the theme. You know, most kids from divorced families come through all the upheaval, the stress, the struggles, and don't look any different from kids whose parents were married. And finally, pain is that though even resilient kids, even those kids who have bounced back from all the stress and difficulties, report what I have come to call psychological pain. They may not have a DSM-type psychological problem, but they do suffer from difficult memories and oftentimes from ongoing struggles in their family relationships that are, if not are pathologizing, are very painful to them nevertheless. And we'll look at all these as we go through this. My take-home message from the research, jumping out to a more practical focus, is that my goal is for parents, as we look at this, to be parents. And it's a very simple circular statement, but I think it conveys, if you think about it for a little bit, it conveys lots of subtleties, so that their kids can be just kids, right? Not forever children of divorce. I hate the term children of divorce, even though it's used a lot, because it's as if forever you are what happened to your parents' relationship. My goal in all of this is for kids to get to be just kids. And if kids are going to be just kids, their parents have to step up to the plate and be parents first, to find a way to do it, as difficult as that is. And the second big take-home point is that the solution to all the dilemmas of divorce and custody disputes are more procedural, more relationship than they are substantive. We'll get to this. We're going to examine joint custody in this section of the talk, for example. There isn't a one-size-fits-all solution that's going to work best for kids and for families or for courts. It's all about how you do it. It's all about how you do it. There's no magical solution for judges. There's no magical solutions for families. Parents need to find what's going to work for them, and to doing that, they're going to preserve their child's well-being if they can find a way to do this together, whatever the circumstance is going to be. Let's just take a quick and really broad look at what's happened to families in the United States, and then actually very quickly around the world. Here's the rate of divorce in the United States since 1860s. And if you will see, don't worry a whole lot about the details. This is the number of divorces per 1,000 population. It's one way demographers track divorce. But 1,000, it looks like there's not a lot of divorce, but any population of 1,000 people contains widows, contains babies, contains 12-year-olds, and so on. Marriage and divorce is not real frequent, right, among any of these groups. So it's a way of tracking divorce. And you'll see since the 1860s, divorce generally increased in our country. It declined during the Great Depression. And there's some evidence that's happening now. If people can't afford to split up, they stay together, right? If they can afford to split up, they're able to escape an unhappy relationship. We think we get married just for love. We don't, right? And you find this out when you split up. Money, other issues are very much a part of that relationship. There was a giant blip in divorce following World War II, not surprisingly. Divorce, interestingly, declined during the 1950s. During that period of time when all those television shows that I watched as a kid and thought, this is what families are always about. They all look like Leave It to Beaver. Interestingly, those shows were produced during an unusual time in American history. Andy Cherlin, a sociologist at Johns Hopkins, has talked about this at some length. Divorce rates skyrocketed in the late 60s and through 1970. They peaked in 1979 and again in 1981, and they have declined since, right? Divorce has gone down in our country since the late 80s. Do not, though, feel heartened by this. The main reason why divorce has gone down is that the people who are most at risk for divorce are selecting out of the marriage pool, right? They are having children outside of marriage, as we'll see, and they are cohabiting without ever getting married, as we will see. So that's the main explanation for the decline of divorce. You don't get legally divorced if you're never legally married. Another way of looking at divorce rates, again, the references for all the articles that I reference on these PowerPoints you'll find on the slide at the very end. This is another way of looking at the risk of divorce by the number of years you've been married for different ethnic groups, and just focusing on the the kind of pink line in the middle, you'll see that after 20 years of marriage, about half of all first marriages end in divorce. And that's where you get that common statistic. Nowadays, it's a little less than half of first marriages end in divorce. Maybe about 40% of marriages end in divorce, again, because people at most risk for divorce are selecting out of marriage. And you'll see here, and this becomes important, ethnic differences in the rates of divorce. Asian Americans are less likely to divorce. African Americans are more likely. I mentioned births to unmarried women have been increasing, and this is important for us to be aware of. I mentioned several times, I'm using the term divorce, but it's not just the end of a marriage, it's the end of a relationship. In the United States today, 40% of children, 40% of children are born outside of marriage. 40%. Almost 1 in 2 children are born outside of marriage. In 1950, that was less than 5%. And as you can see, that number has increased steadily over the years. Here's something I didn't think happened, because this was maybe my parents. I was born in 1952. I didn't think my parents had sex, except once or twice, actually 3 times. I have 2 sisters, right? But teenagers in 1952 actually did have sex. As a matter of fact, our best evidence says they probably had more sex back then than teenagers are having today. Yeah. But what happened when you got her pregnant? You married her, right? It's not sexuality that's changed. It's what happens when you get pregnant that's changed. You don't get married today, right? So this is not so much a sexuality issue. This is, depending how you look at it, a contraception, abortion, shotgun wedding change. Big ethnic differences to be aware of. Again, this is based on census data, U.S. Census data. In 2009, 72% of African American children were born outside of marriage. It's not surprisingly when you hear people say kids from single-parent families are doomed, it's not surprising for advocates for African American families says that's a racially stereotyped statement, right? We have a different arrangement, a different culture. And that statement is wrong. It's overreaching. There are struggles, though. It is harder to be a single parent. Hispanic families, about half of children are born outside of marriage. It's hardly, though, just an issue for minorities. 29% of white majority American children are born outside of marriage as well. Again, smaller numbers for Asians, but it's not still significant. Another thing that's happened over time and happening more and more, living together, cohabiting, living together outside of marriage. This is a different way of portraying that change over time historically. These are rates of cohabitation for different birth cohorts. So the 1928 through 32, those are people who were born in that year and how many of them lived together. And over on the far right, 58 through 62, those are people who would be, 50 years old on average, about how many of them live together. And you can see cohabitation increase dramatically. In the United States today, upwards of half of couples live together prior to marriage. More and more are living together as an alternative to marriage. Of course, that's harder to track because there's no, when are they might they get married, right? We do know that in other places, particularly in Northern Europe, Scandinavia in particular, that many people live together clearly for years and years as an alternative to marriage. This also happens in places like France, or Quebec province, and Canada. We know that's increasing also in the United States, but less rapidly than elsewhere in the world, less rapidly than even in other English-speaking countries like the United Kingdom or New Zealand and Australia. But that is happening more and more. Still, the pattern in the U.S. tends to be for people who cohabit before marriage, it's more a step in the U.S., a step toward marriage rather than an alternative to. But my crystal ball is kind of cloudy about what's going to happen in the future. Right? If we follow these trends for other Northern European countries, Australia, New Zealand, England, this is probably going to be more of an alternative to marriage. It's certainly true for mediation and for custody disputes. Many of these involve people who are not married to each other, in part because these disputes tend to arise early in a relationship when children are young. That's when things break up. Cohabiting relationships, by the way, are more likely to break up than marriages are. So that happens even more frequently. Question?
It was related to the last sentence of what you just said, is that I've seen the majority of research that says if you live together before marriage, statistically that couple's more likely to divorce. Is there any research that you've seen that if you cohabitate but not marry, is there any correlation about how much longer you would stay together than if you do marry?
Yeah, cohabitations that stay cohabitations are again, definitely more likely to break up than marriages if you move to marriage. It is true in general, if you cohabit before marriage, that idea of practicing to find out if he or she is the right one is totally wrong. Actually, you're more likely to get divorced. There's two exceptions on this without going on. There's some evidence that, at least from Australia, that in more recent cohorts, that's not happening. More people are cohabiting, but it's not that you're more likely to get divorced. It's not that you're less likely to either. It's just looking more like you're the same rate. Also, there's some recent research suggests that if you cohabit with the intention of getting married, that your divorce rate is no different from those who cohabit, who never cohabit and get married. So that marriage intention still leads to a more lasting relationship in our country. Just quick question, I got a lot of stuff to cover.
What effect does divorce have on the numbers of couples that are deciding to cohabitate and not marry? Is there statistics on that?
It's a great unanswered question. I think the biggest effects of divorce in our country is not necessarily on kids from divorced family, but it's on young people in general. You know, the reason why I hear all the time from young people, the reason I'm not getting married is I don't want to get divorced. And I'm 100% certain if you don't get married, you are not ever going to get divorced, right? But I think that people are afraid of divorce. And I think that the increase in divorce is actually behind a lot of the increase in cohabitation. I can't prove that to you, that's just my supposition. There is a divorce divide in the United States and a marriage divide. People with college education are much more likely to both get married and much less likely to end their relationship, have their relationship end in divorce. And this is something that I often lecture about. I've been fortunate enough to be asked to lecture a lot in Italy and Korea and different places around the world, Belgium. And I always say, the United States likes to lead the world, and we do lead the world. We have the highest rate of divorce in the industrialized world. But divorce is not just an American phenomenon. This is a phenomenon of the industrialized world. And you'll see up there UK, Australia, Korea, Italy, even traditional countries.
What's the yellow?
The yellow is Italy. Okay. Low rates of divorce. Divorce hasn't been that legal in Italy for very long, but it's also because of the culture. Legal separation without legally getting divorced is going to be more common in places like Italy. We talk a lot, we hear a lot of talk in our country about decline of family values, and that's the reason for increases in divorce. Just my personal experience on this is I was asked to give a talk maybe 5 years ago, maybe a bit longer, at Seoul National University in South Korea, to a group like you, people interested in divorce and mediation. And I asked the group, I said, just rhetorically, could you raise your hand if you know of somebody who's been divorced? Of course, expecting, would you raise your hand if you know somebody's been divorced? In this room, right? Of course, everybody, expecting that to happen. Everybody's hands to shoot up. Nobody in the room raised their hand. And I'm there, why did he just fly halfway around the world to talk about divorce? Nobody knows him. Well, actually, everybody knew somebody who was divorced, but it would be shaming to publicly admit this. And it is still shaming in South Korea to get divorced. There is a hurry to get remarried so you can look normal. And kids, apparently in South Korea now at least, have very little contact with one parent or another. They're back with the remarried parent and try to be a part of this normal family. But despite those very strong family values, and in other ways family is valued, look at the divorce rate, even in South Korea. All right? Industrialization changes families. It changes gender roles, it changes values, it changes economics, it changes families. That's the backdrop. Let's look, what about some of the consequences for kids? I said the first thing that I talk about is stress. Here's one stress. Divorce is an economic hardship, presents an economic hardship for kids. If you just look at the rates of, on your far left here, the rates, number of children living in poverty, and I'm going to look at just how poor this is in a second, by a function of whether you're living with a single mom or a single dad or with married parents. And if you are just statistically in the United States today, living with a single mom, the chance that your child living below the official federal poverty levels is greater than 40%. If your parents are married, it's less than 10%. Right? Welfare reform of the 1990s has been subtitled the Promotion of Marriage Act as well. Our federal government wants people to get married. We talk about it a lot for moral reasons, but there's good economic reasons too, right? Welfare payments go to single-parent families, right? If families stay together, we're going to save welfare money. There's debates about just exactly how much, because of people are more likely to split when they're poor, but the numbers are big. And just if you look across, broken down by ethnic groups, it's not just an issue of ethnicity. Being married is associated with much less poverty, whether you're white, whether you're black, whether you're Hispanic, or whether you're Asian. For kids, this presents all kinds of issues. It's not just a matter of whether or not you can get the latest sneakers, right? It's a matter of your living circumstances. It's a matter of if your parents are together and now they split up, it may be a matter of moving from your home or your apartment, wherever you live, because that's too expensive now, which can mean changing schools and maybe going into not such a good school district. It can mean losing contact with your friends. It can mean mom, who maybe was staying at home or only working part-time, now needs to work more. It can mean dad, who's maybe paying child support, now needs to work more. It means parents are fighting about money as well as you and other things. Lots of changes for kids. What is the basic economic problem with getting divorced? Well, it's actually pretty simple, and this also illustrates how poor is. First of all, this. Over 40% of kids with a single mom are living below the poverty level. What is the poverty level? The poverty level is in 2008, if you made over $17,000 in your family of three, you were out of poverty. You were not living in poverty. Yeah, are you kidding me? Right? $17,000 for a family of three. Single parent with a single parent. So we're talking about 40% below that level. Below that level. And this slide also shows you why divorce causes economic hardship. Here are again based on Labor Department statistics. In 1978, to be a four-person household, to be below poverty level, according to federal guidelines, you needed to make over $21,000, over $21,834. Right? But now if we take this four-person family and we divorce them, and so now we have a single-person household and a three-person household, that household needs, the three-person needs $17,000, the one-person needs $11,000. Just to maintain that same standard of living, that same family needs 30% more money. Why? It's the basic problem. Because it costs more money to live in two households than one. This is why people don't get divorced as often during economic hard time. It's cheaper. College students know that. It's called getting a roommate, right? Economists call it economies of scale, right? No wonder everybody, though, is feeling screwed. Economically in divorce, they are. Just to maintain the same living, you need 30% more money. It's only the very, very wealthy that escape this trap. That's only one stressor for kids. Another stressor is lost contact with one of your parents. I showed you this slide earlier today. This is how infrequently divorced fathers see their kids on average back in 1988. I use that because that was a good comparison point for my mediation study. I've gotten so many arguments about this slide over the years. People said, fathers have changed. Fathers are so much more involved with their kids today. Emery, this is a crock. And when I hear that often enough, you know what I do? I go and do research. Right? That's a real tough guy attitude. And here's what I found in my research with Paul Amato and one of Paul's graduate students. We've looked at changes in father involvement over time, divorced fathers' involvement, 4 different national samples in the United States. And if you look down here, the 18%, the red on the bottom slide, that's the data that I was showing you before from 1988. And between 1988 and 2002, it's absolutely true, more fathers are more involved with their kids in the United States. The number who see their kids once a week or more have jumped from 18% to 37%. It's doubled. Right? But it's also true that there still is 18% of dads, at least in 2002, who weren't seeing their kids at all. And the most common arrangement in the United States, the modal arrangement, was to see your kids somewhere between a few times, to see your kids several times a year. That's a wide range gap just because these national surveys didn't have more fine-grained analysis for us to break that down. So things have changed, but they may not have changed as much as some people would like us to believe. We'll look at the parallel issue about how much joint physical custody has increased later on. Another thing that changes for kids, another stressor for kids, is the quality of your relationship with both your parents. Here's one thing I want to show you from a national study. In this study, a good relationship was described as being able to answer yes to 2 of these 4 questions. Are you satisfied with the amount of affection you get from that parent? Yes. Do you enjoy doing things with that parent? No. Do you want to be like that parent? No. Do you feel close to that parent? Yeah. Then you've got a good relationship. Then you've got a good relationship in this study. Okay. Low bar for a good relationship. And here's what was found, a national survey from the National Survey of Children. First of all, kids got along better with their mothers than their fathers, not surprisingly. But kids from divorced families, in particular, had much worse relationships with their dads, or a much larger percentage of them had bad relationships with their dads. They could only answer 1 or fewer of those questions yes, 33% of them. This was a national sample at the ages 12 to 16. By the time these same kids got to be 18 to 22, that number had jumped up to almost 70%, could only answer yes to 1 of those items for their dads. And now the differences for mothers, which were identical before, whether the mother was divorced or married, that became statistically significant as well. Your relationship with your mom was worse if she was divorced. So you've got all this economic hardship, you've got lost contact with one of your parents, you've got troubled relationships with at least one and probably both of them on average. And then there's something else. This is a case where I think maybe a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is exposure to involvement in conflict between your parents. All sorts of research, and we'll look a little bit at that research in a second, shows that conflict is bad for kids. If you'll permit me, this is both my wake-up call and a little demonstration of one small way in which conflict can be harmful to kids. Will you pay attention? Please? Do I have your attention now? Right. Anybody startled? Anybody nervous? Anybody's pupils dilate? Anybody's heart rate go up? Right? Just by a quick yell that I said was going to a bunch of professionals. And it's scary to you. Now let's make that, your parents, happening over and over again. They're fighting chronically about you, and we add in things that not only are they fighting and arguing and doing all that scary stuff, even babies cry, right? When people are yelling and screaming, it's scary, right? But now They're like one parent's telling you one thing, one parent's telling you something else. They're putting each other down. Is it any surprise this is bad for kids? Right? Mark Cummings at Notre Dame, a friend of mine for 30 years, has done great systematic research in analog studies to demonstrate this. And I've done lots of research, as have others in the field, showing the more parents fight, the worse kids fare. And it completely makes sense. Completely makes sense. In this case, this is a picture of what happened. A couple not far from Charlottesville, Virginia, they split up. They went to court on a temporary hearing, probably lasted 20 minutes. Said, we can't decide who should stay in the house. And the judge says, well, I don't have time to have a full hearing. What I'm going to do is, on a temporary basis, husband, you move out of the house. Wife, you get to stay there. We'll have a full hearing 6 months from now. Then we'll decide who really gets to keep the house. The husband said, okay, yes, Your Honor. I'm happy to follow your rule. He went and got a backhoe, and he tore down the house. Tore down the house. Right? You know, I try to, my friends in economics who talk about the rational actor model of man, I always say, what's rational about this, right? And what I think of is, I don't care what people do with their property. I don't care how many tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars they spend on lawyer fees, or, you know, but this is what too many parents are doing to their kids. Right? They deliberately, sometimes, and blindly, other times, hurting their kids to get back at him. Right? The term blind rage takes on new meaning, completely new meaning.
Question. The judge, the lawyer, whoever was involved in this particular case, did they not fear that this would happen, just like we're aware of our clients that may be suicidal?
Most dangerous job on the bench, by far, is being a family court judge. Yes, and it's unfortunately, it's one of the most important jobs, and many of those on the bench end up serving as family court judges on the way to where they really want to be, which is trying something else. And I think we really need specialized family courts in every state. And I think family court judges is an incredibly important position that should be coveted and sought after with special training, not a way station, which it is too often. Not the only case, just so you know. This was famous a few years ago. A physician in New York City sent his estranged wife an email that said, you'll be transformed from a gold digger into an ash and rubble digger. Kablooey, their Manhattan townhouse blew up. Unfortunately, the physician who sent this email was killed in the blast. Again, what you do with your property is one thing. Blowing up your kids is something else. Now, I don't want to say, of course, there's going to be conflict in divorce, and there needs to be conflict sometimes. You know, the only way you get things changed and solved is through conflict, right? We deal with conflict. So the issue isn't don't fight or don't disagree. The issue is how you manage it. Right? We're talking about a conflict resolution technique. We need to talk. We need to be able to disagree. All kinds of good research, and again, this is Cummings and Davies have summarized this nicely, shows that conflict is less harmful to kids if it's contained between parents, right? You present a united front to your kids, you disagree behind closed doors, right? Common sense. Divorced parents can do that too. We're united front here, let's talk on the phone later on, right? Let's not talk during the exchange, let's go to the mediator's office and work this out, or the family therapist's office, or whatever. Conflict is less harmful to kids if it's less intense emotionally or physically, right? I gave you an example of intense conflict when I shouted. That's more scary to kids. It's less harmful to kids if it's resolved, right? There's something that's special about getting things worked out, even if it's only agreeing to disagree. Conflict's less harmful to kids if it doesn't involve the child. And too many kids in this situation are asked to carry messages back and forth, or asked to be spies, or asked to be mediators, or are just put in the middle of the situation. And really, I want to take kids out of the middle. Again, I talked about how that middle role feels as a mediator. I also don't want kids to be asked to make adult decisions. Mom and I can't agree about what the schedule would be. Dad and I can't agree. Why don't you where do you want to live, Johnny? Do you want to live with Mom or do you want to live with me? Now that's putting Johnny in a really great situation when he's 7 years old. Now if Johnny is 14 and he comes to me on his own and says, I'm not happy, I want to be in this arrangement or that, then I listen to Johnny, but then I also end up making the decision for Johnny, taking Johnny's wishes into account. I don't put him in the position of being decision maker. Now let's talk about risk and then get to resilience. There's been a lot of controversy, I think less so now. I hope that I've contributed to resolving it, about how divorce affects kids. It used to be argued that the kids from divorced families were doomed forever. Others used to focus on the resilience of kids from divorced families. I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's some combination of both, and I want to focus on that. First, just one bit of evidence for risk. If your parents are divorced, this is back to this national sample of kids, you are twice as likely to see a mental health professional than if your parents are married. Now, admittedly, I don't think seeing a mental health professional is necessarily a bad thing. I don't think that's a perfect indicator of a kid's mental health, because sometimes, as we all know, parents take their child to see a mental health professional, not because the kid's having a problem, but because the parent's having a problem, right? But what this question is it's an easy question that can be asked in a national survey with a national sample of kids and of families. And what we find is that, again, kids from divorced families are twice as likely to see a shrink as kids whose parents are married. And just accept that as a rough measure of mental health. Here's, though, what I want to also suggest. This is our measure of risk, but let me just do a very small trick with numbers with you. Let's draw those bars the other way around. What's the chances of never seeing a shrink and your parents are divorced? And if you look at it here, you look at it, the picture tells a different story, doesn't it? Those numbers, those look big. That looks small. It's the same data, I just drew the bar different ways. Does it increase risk? Does divorce increase risk statistically? Yes, it increases risk. Do most kids from divorced families go through all the stress we've been talking about and never have to see a mental health professional? That also is true, right? Most are resilient. There's an increase in risk, but most kids from divorced families are resilient. That works with whether you see a shrink item, it also works with all kinds of other items. Here's the same evidence. This is ever received psychological help, ever get expelled or suspended from school, ever have to repeat a grade, ever have to drop out of high school. Being from a single parent family is a risk factor, statistical risk factor for all these outcomes, but we can draw all these outcomes the other way around and see that most kids from single parent families aren't seeing mental health professionals, are graduating from high school, aren't being expelled or suspended, and so on. Right? So we want to look at both sides of the coin. Right? The glass it's partly an issue of, is the glass half empty or the glass half full? But in this case, it's really, the glass is about 20% empty, but about 80% full. About 80% of kids are getting through their parents' divorce without obvious mental health problems. For those of you who are familiar with effect sizes, here's a meta-analysis that Paul Amato completed of studies that were done in the 1990s. And all I point out to you is those are modest effect sizes. When you compare kids from divorced families with kids unmarried families, the differences, again, are not big. That's, again, because most kids are not having psychological problems. It's both a risk and resilience story. A little bit more detail. So an effect size is a way of summarizing. An effect size is this. Effect size is converting currencies into US dollars. So it's the price of, how many euros does a bottle of water cost? Well, we'll convert the euro to US dollars to have a common metric, a way of putting them together. Well, meta-analysis, the technique, converts the results of different studies into a common unit. So it combines results across studies. And it's a standard deviation unit. We don't need to go into the details, but this is telling you it's equivalent to this. Do you know what IQ test? IQ test has a mean of 100, a standard deviation of 15. These differences are about the same as the difference between an IQ of 100 and an IQ of about 102, 103. Okay? So definitely the kids whose parents are married have the higher IQ, But how big is that? It's really a couple of IQ points. So again, like the other way I showed it, some kids are at risk, most aren't having obvious psychological problems. I underscored the obvious because I want to get to psychological pain in just a second. By the way, this is just a correlation, right? We find a correlation between divorce and marriage, like I portray in this slide. This is for math scores. Kids from married families have higher math scores. This study was done as looking back in time when everybody's parents were together. Were those differences still there? Because if the differences were there when the kids' parents were still married at age 7 here, they weren't an effective divorce. And this is what you typically find, is there's some selection into divorce. Kids' problems predate divorce, but some of the problems actually seem to be a result of divorce as well. In other words, that correlation between divorce and psychological problems among kids really does look like it's causal. And I've even done it, I won't go into detail, I've even studied twins to try to document that the difference results due to divorce aren't due to selection into divorce, but are causally related to divorce. And the twin studies are very complicated, but Brian D'Onofrio, one of my graduate students, has published 2 or 3 papers studying kids over time, Child Development, Developmental Psych, Journal of Abnormal Psychology, anybody who's really interested in the details of this. It looks like it's a real consequence of divorce. Technical issue. Now, here's something that I think is hugely important. Okay? Stress, risk, resilience. Right? Lots of stress for kids, a real causal risk for increased psychological problems among kids from divorced families. Most kids are resilient. I hear all the time, Sally is so resilient. We get divorced, she's not having any problems. As a matter of fact, she's taking care of her little sister. She's become my best friend. I confide in her all the time. Matter of fact, we almost double date sometimes. We've become such good friends. And what a resilient little girl Sally is. That's not what we mean by resilient, right? What I mean by resilient is Sally gets to be a kid, not mom's or dad's parent, right? Resilience is not parentification. This is a more subtle, only a few studies, I've done a handful of them myself, have been done of this process of parentification. Family therapists talk about it a lot. I think it's really important to talk about it in divorce, right? Parentified kids are kids who get in the position of taking care of their parents. And the real problem with parentification is taking care of their parents emotionally as opposed to practically. It's not such a big deal if you have to do some more dishes, right? Or maybe if you have to watch your little siblings somewhat more. Maybe that's even a good thing, right? But if you need to take care of your mother's or father's emotions, and this happens in divorce, this happens in depression, this happens in substance abuse a lot, where kids become the caretakers, that is not healthy for kids. And that certainly is not what I mean by resilience. Shelley Torr Martin, a graduate student of mine, developed a measure of parentification that predicted depression among college students. And here's some of the things we don't want to have happen. One of her items is, I often feel more like my mother's parent than her child. We don't want that to happen. This study all focus on young women and their mothers. It's not like it's just mothers, it's mothers and fathers, of course. My mother really needs my support to manage things in her life. We don't want that to happen. Part of my job in my family is taking care of my mother. My mother thinks of me as her best friend. Right? That might sound good, that might sound healthy. That's a lot of pressure on that kid, emotional pressure on that kid. I had to grow up too fast. I didn't get to be just a kid, which gets back to my slogan. I want kids to get to be kids. Right? This measure predicted depression in Shelley's study. Tara Paris, another graduate student of mine, found that it predicted lower ratings of warmth. Even though your mother thought you were her best friend, the child thought, right? This is a burden on me. She also found that it predicted increased conflict and an increased likelihood of a child feeling like it's their job to intervene in conflict. Right? A kid's job, I say this to kids all the time, you know. What's your 7-year-old coming in is being parentified in a family. If dad gets sick, you call up the doctor and drive him to the doctor? No, of course I don't drive him to the doctor. If I get sick, he takes me. Oh, that's right. Dad's job is to take care of you, right? Your job is what? I'm supposed to. Well, I think your job is to be a kid, right? Well, yeah. Well, what does being a kid mean? Well, it means you're supposed to have fun. You're supposed to do good in your schoolwork. You're supposed to listen to your parents mostly. You do that same. But you're not supposed to take care of your parents. You wouldn't take them to the doctor. It's really not your job to make him happy, to make him feel less lonely. It's not your job, and this happens a lot, to be sleeping with him or her at night so they don't feel so lonely. A very concrete way where this comes out a whole lot, right? It looks good. Kids can like that. Parents can like that. It's not kids getting to be kids. It's kids taking care of their parents' needs. Yes?
A caveat to like the sleeping together thing, being Haitian, this is culturally.
Yes, I was going to say, I'm not talking about co-sleeping. I mean, there's cultural issues where people co-sleep, and that's a common thing. But if it hasn't been in your culture, and now you're 7, and now I'm lonely, so come in my bed and take care of me, that's a very different situation than co-sleeping. So, parentification is one caveat, important caveat on resilience. So is this, psychological pain. I have had this happen to me. I can't tell you how many times this has happened to me. I get this, my office door at the University of Virginia. I'll open it up. So, Professor Emery, and they, yes, you're the divorce guy, right? And I learned to answer, yeah, I'm the divorce guy, right? Well, my roommate was in, I took your child psychopathology class, which I've taught for 30 years at UVA. And she said, you're the divorce guy. Could I talk with you for a minute? I come into my office. And so come into my office, it's like, here it is, it's spring break. I'm graduating in May. I'm going to medical school. Next year I'm going to Johns Hopkins. I've been at the best medical school in the country. And I've been a great student. My parents are divorced. And I went home over spring break. And I said to Mom, that Dad wanted to take me out for dinner on Saturday night before Sunday graduation. And she went nuts. And she said, well, maybe he paid for your college, but who's the one who raised you? I can't believe you're putting your father ahead of me. And I tried to talk to Dad about this, and he said he's not going to pay for my last semester now. Something along these lines, right? And you're like, I just know it. I'm going to walk down with my diploma, and they're going to be standing on opposite sides of the stage to see who I go to first. Right? I don't think I'm going to go. I don't want to go to graduation. Now, think about this for a second. In my made-up case example, but I've had lots of things that like this. This is a resilient, right? Going to medical school, if you think that's healthy. Graduating from UVA, doing well, thoughtful enough to seek out advice, right? But dealing with this stuff. Right? I had a student, it's out there on the web if you want to Google it on Amazon. I had a student who worked in my lab once who wrote a book when she graduated. Her parents were divorced. How to plan a wedding if your parents are divorced, right? Because, even your day isn't about you. It's still about them so many years later. That's why the 12-year follow-up stuff we talked about is so critical down the road, right? The grandchildren are born, right? I mean, it doesn't end, right? Your parents. What my point is, though, is that this fictional person is resilient, but something important is going on, right? And that something important is going on is what I term psychological pain, right? This hurts. This is painful. Gosh, it was probably 12, 13 years ago, I wanted to study psychological pain. I did a study of psychological pain. And we created a measure that I'm going to show you in a second. The thing I wanted to tell you, though, is that nobody would accept this paper. What is psychological pain? That's not in the DSM, right? That's not on the MMPI. Well, it's not and it wasn't, but any of you who are interested in, McDonald and Leary had a great measure. Psychological pain is real. The same areas of the brain that light up when you experience physical pain light up when you experience emotional pain. Emotional pain is a hot new area of study, well supported by neuroscience. It exists, even though it was hard to measure, right? Lots of things we can't measure are very important. Let me show you. And here's one way that we measured it. We said we went and got 100, or I think it says 100, but I think it was something like 98, well-adjusted young people from the University of Virginia whose parents were divorced. And we asked them this question. We asked, I'd be a different person if my parents had never gotten divorced. 73% of that 100 or so young people agreed with that. Now, honestly, I'm not sure how painful that was. I'm not sure if that was I'd be a different person if my parents never got divorced, or if that was duh, of course I'd be a different person if my parents got divorced, right? But if you go down, 49 out of that 100, 49% said, I worry about events like graduations or weddings when both my parents are going to be there. My case example is not a rare example. That's a very basic example. Or 29% said, I wonder if my dad even loves me. Agreed with that item. Now, think about this. I've spent some time, even on the DSM-5 website. Your parents not loving you is not a symptom of any mental disorder. It hasn't been proposed to be a symptom of any mental disorder. I have 5 children myself, right? My number one job as a parent, I think, is to make sure that they all know that I love them, even though the teenagers don't want to believe it, right? That's my number one job. Almost a third of kids from divorced families didn't feel that from their dads. Yes, it's not just about dads. Of course, in the study, they weren't seeing their dads all that often. That's part of the issue. I'm sure it applies to moms too, but they were seeing their moms more often. I think that's psychologically important, even if it's not related to a mental disorder. Now, we couldn't ask kids from married families questions like, I wish I'd be a different person if my parents had never gotten divorced, because of course their parents had never gotten divorced, but we could ask them some of these questions. And so 10% of kids whose parents were married said, I worried about events like graduation and weddings when both my parents are going to be there, because as we know, married parents don't always get along so well, and they can put their kids in the middle too. But that was 1/5 the rate of kids compared to kids from divorced families. And just to jump to another example, 1 in 10 kids who grew up with their dad in the same household, married to their mom, still said, I wonder if my dad even loves me. Interesting issue that I need to explore sometime in some research. Actually, when I say I need to explore, the graduate students here know means I need to find a graduate student to explore this. Right? But 1 in 10 whose parents were married said that, but 3 times the rate in divorced families said that. Right? So resilient kids are not parentified kids. Resilience doesn't mean the absence of pain. Right? Pain is a huge part of divorce, right? Even for well-functioning, resilient kids. And there's all kinds of other ways to measure this, but we'll just leave this as this example. But I have to skip over that. So there's the main points: stress, risk, resilience, and pain. Now, I want to start to focus on individual differences, which is ultimately what we're interested in. Parents can help to determine, even in the middle of divorce, you as a parent can help to determine whether your child is going to be at risk or going to be resilient. And this gets back to what we're doing with mediation and other interventions in divorce. By the way you manage the conflict, by the way you manage your parenting and so on, and I want to focus on that. Parents can't, though, prevent pain. They can't make divorce not painful for kids. And I just want to underscore with this point, I'm not sure that parents should try. Okay? Kids should be allowed to be sad, to be hurt, to grieve. I've had too many guilt-ridden parents over the years do things that will say to the kid something like, oh, sit them down for that dreadful talk, which people write songs about, right? Remembering, the day their parents told them they were going to get divorced. That's what a big, painful memory it remains. But I've had too many guilt-ridden parents say, okay, well, I want to tell you we're getting divorced. But don't worry about it. Let's all go out and have a happy meal, right? That's not about the child, right? That's about the parent, right? Kids, we want to minimize pain for sure, but kids have to be allowed to have their own feelings. And most kids aren't going to want their parents to split up. The only time they're going to want their parents to split up is when things are so bad that it's destructive to them. Then it can be a relief. But the answer isn't to make things so terrible in the two-parent family that your kids want a divorce, right? Doesn't make sense. What, though, can parents do to promote resilience over risk? In Marriage, Divorce, and Children's Adjustment, I review the research database for this, and I conclude there's 4 strong predictors of better adjustment among kids from divorced families. The first is having a good relationship with at least one parent. Right? A good relationship is an authoritative relationship, one that is both loving and firm in discipline. The second is there being little conflict or conflict being controlled, that kids are kept out of the middle of the parent conflict. The third is economic stability. And the fourth is having a good relationship with the other parent. It's typically the dad these days. Here's the problem. In mediation, we tended to promote, as we saw earlier today, we tended to promote all these outcomes. I always want to promote all these outcomes, but sometimes you can't, right? Sometimes conflict won't end, for example. Sometimes we have to make compromises. Then the question is, what do you do now? Probably the most difficult issue that comes up in this area, at least around parenting, is if there's a high conflict divorce, and we can quibble about what high conflict divorce means. If there's a high conflict divorce, what do you do about kids' contact with both of their parents? Right. Is it better off for the child to have a relationship with both of their parents but to be exposed to conflict a lot? Or are kids better off spending most of the time with just one parent so they're not so exposed to all the fighting? Right. I listed those factors back here in terms of their order of importance to say that I don't want this to happen, but if conflict can't be controlled, from the perspective at least of kids' mental health, you could argue this based on other grounds, but from the perspective of kids' mental health, if conflict can be controlled in terms of their mental health, kids are going to be better off not seeing one of their parents so much because that keeps them out of the middle of something that's even more toxic. It's unhealthy not to see one of your parents. It's more unhealthy to be living your life in the middle of a war zone. Yes?
Can you clarify when you said that the statistics about children feeling that their father didn't love them, can you tell me what the difference is between a child who sees love with a parent that they're living with versus love from a parent that they're not living with? How is that defined?
You're asking a huge question. How it was defined operationally is what a college student wrote on a form, how they answered a question on the form, right? Practically, there's all kinds of ways. I think there's many ways to show love. See your child regularly according to what your schedule is as a way of showing love. If you're not seeing them as often you want, keep a journal that you show to your child later on. Emailing, paying support as you're supposed to as a way of demonstrating love. There's all kinds of ways to show love. I understand, I've been divorced myself, I understand there's no real substitute for face-to-face contact for you, but there are ways to approximate. There are ways to get closer. And as I want to get into, because I want to go through the whole issue of joint custody for a second, sometimes compromises need to be made. And again, You could argue that it should always be 50-50 contact, for example, with both parents on the basis of that's what's fair to parents. But you can't make that argument in terms of that's what's going to be best for kids' mental health. That's not, the evidence does not support that. It supports the factors in this order. And that particularly comes into play when you come into joint physical custody. If you have, and we're going to look at joint custody in detail shortly. If you have two parents who don't work things out, again, we saw this morning that most parents do work things out, and if you work things out in mediation, it's a whole different story, or else with your lawyers or elsewhere. If you can't work things out, you're coming in front of a judge, you're one of that top 10, 5, 2% of people who are making their way to court. 50-50, or something like it in joint physical custody, I'm saying, is the right solution, but for the wrong group of people. It's the right solution for everybody else who can work it out. It's not the right solution for you because you are fighting so much, you can't work out this issue on your own. And from a judge's perspective, the law is so unclear. Joint physical custody might seem like a fair solution here. Well, you're both fighting, you both want to see your kids. This seems fair. Well, it's maybe fair to the parents. But if your job is promoting children's best interests, which it is in every state, that's the guiding principle, and if we interpret that as promoting kids' psychological best interests, which is how most judges interpret it, that is not promoting kids' best psychological interests, based on the research, and I'm going to show you the research just now. Right? Here's the short take-home message to begin with, and we'll look at the details behind it. Joint physical custody, by that I mean something around 25 to 30% time, up to 50% of the time. Doesn't have to be 50-50, right? Usually, if you're spending 4 overnights out of every 2 weeks, if you're spending every weekend with your kids, I consider that to be joint physical custody. So it doesn't have to be week on, week off. But joint physical custody is the best and the worst arrangement for kids. It's the best arrangement if conflict is low or contained and parents work to coordinate it for kids. It's the worst arrangement if it's used to resolve a high conflict dispute and leaves kids in the middle of a war zone. It's the best and the worst. This becomes controversial, and so what I want to do is show you the evidence on which I base this. First, and this is important for mediation to define some terms, legal custody and physical custody. Legal custody is involving decisions, and again, a lot of times I don't use the term custody, I'll just talk about decisions, but just for those of you familiar, joint legal custody, term used in most states, usually involves sharing three decisions. Elective medical care, whether your child sees a therapist, which for those of you who are going to be family therapists, by the way, if you get a kid from a divorced family coming in for therapy, one parent's bringing them in for therapy, ask them if they share legal custody. Because if they do, you need both parents' permission to see that child in therapy, right? Getting braces is elective medical care, right? That's a joint decision. Taking your child to an emergency room with appendicitis, no, divorced parents don't have to get permission, right? It's elective medical care, it's not emergency medical care. That's one thing that's shared. Second thing that's shared is education, whether your child goes to a public school or private school, something basic like that. Third is religious upbringing. That's it. Joint legal custody doesn't mean you have to have the same rules in both households. It doesn't mean you get to second guess that other parent. Doesn't mean that they have to, that other parent can't give them Fruit Loops when you want your child to be on an all-natural diet all the time. No, you can still give Fruit Loops if that's what you want, right? Doesn't mean everything has to be coordinated. Although working towards coordination is a good idea, and we'll talk about that as we go on. Physical custody is time. It can range anywhere from 50-50, as I said. Most studies define joint physical custody starting as around 25 to 30% of the time. In the law, different states in the United States have, for a period of time, had presumptions favoring joint physical custody. They usually don't last. The state of Wisconsin right now has one of the stronger joint physical custody laws. Australia right now has a joint physical custody law. Belgium, as far as I know, at least the Flemish part of Belgium, is the first country that has a 50-50 presumption that's operating right now. But most states don't have presumptions. They let judges decide this on a case-by-case basis, just as a way of background. And of course, different judges have different biases for or against. And as one of my favorite judges said to me recently, she was a family court judge for 15 years in Maryland. I think I'll leave her unnamed because of the videotape. But she said she always was trying to encourage people who were before her to settle. She says, you know, be careful if you're asking a judge to make a decision for you, because you don't know what happened in his or her life last week. Maybe she's just been through a divorce herself, right? You want to leave your kid's future up to that? Or do you want to rethink this and maybe work things out yourself, right? Because there's all sorts of things that can come into play. All right. So, what do we know data-wise? Yes, quick question.
Before you move on, you have a line here that you need communication method for coordinating mid-level parenting.
Right.
So you're saying that because joint legal custody just focuses on those three big issues.
Yeah, you need to deal with that legally, but practically parents need to deal with making day-to-day decisions, like the tattoo, like the piercings, like what the curfew is going to be. And so, and we'll talk about this in our next segment, how you can help parents to coordinate parenting in mediation, even though that's not technically a part of the law. That's where, as I said this morning, that's where I slip in parenting and co-parenting advice. But let me get to that this afternoon, if that's okay. Here's what we know about legal and physical custody. One thing we know is that joint legal custody has become the norm. Terrible data are kept on courts. Fortunately, there's a group in Wisconsin that's been keeping good data on court records. And if you just look over here on the bottom slide, you'll see the increase in blue between 1980 and I think it's 2001 on the bottom in joint physical custody. In 1980, less than 20% of legal agreements in Wisconsin specified joint legal custody. In 2001, that was close to 90%. Throughout the country, almost everybody is sharing joint legal custody. Those three decisions that I mentioned are shared technically. And the best research is showing us that actually parents who share legal custody are having fewer conflicts and are more likely to see their kids on a regular basis, more likely to pay child support and so on. So joint legal custody is working. Here's interesting though, what about joint physical custody, that 50-50 approaching idea that we hear so much about? Are most people doing this? Again, Wisconsin has laws that push people towards joint physical custody. That went from being virtually unknown in 1980. Maybe about 2% of agreements in 1980 in Wisconsin specified joint physical custody. That went up also a lot over the years, but in 2001, about 30% specified joint physical custody in a state where law pushes people towards joint physical custody. So the points are, point here is joint physical custody is increasing. It's still, though, more the exception than the rule, even in a state where it's encouraged. Actually, even in Australia where it's encouraged. My best guess is about maybe 15 to 20% of people nationally are trying joint physical custody. We also know, and we'll look at this closely, that joint physical custody is less stable over time. So in this Wisconsin study, this is estimated at the time of divorce, but if you were to look down the road, that number would shrink. Does joint custody benefit kids? Probably the most cited paper on this, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it, is a meta-analysis, putting the results of different studies together, combining them in those American dollar values. By Bauserman, that was published in 2002 in Journal of Family Psychology, found that joint physical custody was associated with, that joint custody was associated with better psychological health among kids. That study gets used a lot to say that, in fact, we should be promoting joint physical custody. But I think this meta-analysis, like a lot of meta-analysis, has a problem with it. And here's the problem with a meta-analysis. Here's the problem with converting all the different results of different studies to the same unit is that a lot gets lost in the process. It's what I call the chicken McNugget problem. I might get sued for saying this, right? Chicken McNugget, right? It's a tasty little bite. But if you stop to think what's inside, it doesn't taste so good, right? It doesn't taste so good. And really, take a look at what's really inside those chicken McNuggets. You really don't want to know. What's inside of this meta-analysis? There's all kinds of problems. First of all, we're comparing apples and oranges, right? People, and Bauserman documents this, people who elect to have joint custody of their kids get along better. Duh, that's no surprise. So, than those who don't. Not a surprise that kids are doing better then in those families, right? Again, it's a small effect size. It's 0.23 standard deviation units. A difference, as we were saying before, of about between an IQ of 100, maybe 102, 103. Here's something, though, that gets buried by the joint custody advocates when they were trying to use this study. Bauserman found that joint legal custody, which is just kind of custody, sharing custody in name, not in practice, was associated with as much benefit for kids as joint physical custody. So somebody in an adversary setting who wanted to promote, use this study to promote traditional custody arrangements could say, all you need is the name. You don't actually need to see the kids using this study. It's also another issue that you might want to think about is the studies that went into this meta-analysis. The results of 33 different studies put together showing a benefit. Sounds good, right? Again, until you think about what's inside that bite. What is inside of that bite was 22 of the 33 studies were unpublished. 21 of the 22 were unpublished doctoral dissertations. Now, this is speaking anecdotally, but I've sat on a lot of doctoral dissertations after 30 years of being at the University of Virginia. And when that study goes unpublished, there's usually a good reason, right? This result also is completely inconsistent with research on father contact, which shows, again, at effect size, showing that the amount of contact is very, very weakly related to measures of child adjustment, whereas the quality of contact in the far right column makes a difference. So I want to jump ahead to my bottom lines on joint physical custody, or on joint custody in general. My view, I think this is the way things are going, is that joint legal custody, sharing decision-making, again, you can avoid the term altogether if you want to, is and should be the norm. Most parents can do it. That helps them to get along. That joint physical custody, anywhere from that 25% time to 50% of time, is the best and the worst arrangement. I want to encourage parents who can cooperate, who live within geographic proximity. I'm sorry, but I've seen way too many cases where people are sharing joint physical custody and putting babies and infants and toddlers on planes and flying them back and forth. No, not a good idea. But in some proximity to each other, you can get along. I want you to do that, or at least try it, right, to make it work. But if it's not logistically possible, if parents are fighting, joint physical custody is going to be the worst arrangement for kids. And as sad as it's going to be, that the only decision is, and I don't care if you flip a coin, but the kids are going to be better off living with one parent and not seeing the other as much, but being out of the middle of the toxic conflict. I think the demographic exceptions, the fact that it's still rare, I think the instability of joint physical custody over time, both contribute to that conclusion, that it's a good arrangement for those who can pick it and make it work. It's not going to work for most people. It's not the solution to what are we going to do with kids in this situation. Again, as I said at the beginning, the solution isn't substantive. It's really procedural. It's not 50-50. It's how do we find a way to get parents to work out an arrangement that's going to work best for them, best for their kids, live and grow with them over time, which gets us back to mediation, which is where we're going to turn and focus in the afternoon. That's where I'm going to stop for now, except I'll leave you with one last picture, traveling around the world. This was a family in Thailand who were getting divorced. They couldn't decide who was going to get to keep the house. So in the middle of the night, according to CNN, the husband and a bunch of his buddies went and divided the house in two and carried his half of the house back onto his mother's property. To me, this is a pictorial representation of joint physical custody in high conflict situations. And you might also want to remember the story, the biblical story of Solomon, right? The parent who loves the child doesn't want the child to be cut in half.